Hi, I'm Michael Frederick. I'm an EWU alumni, and I'm presenting a research project that I worked on in Professor Phil Watkins' lab in the psychology department. My talk is titled Exploring the Relationship Between Gratitude and Self-Control, a Mediation Analysis. First, I'll give some background on the topics we're researching, and then get into some of the analyses and results. So the three main topics of research in this study are number 1, gratitude, 2, happiness, and 3, self-control. And this study kind of lies at the intersection of the three. And then just as a note, I'll use the terms subjective well-being and happiness interchangeably. So how are gratitude and subjective well-being measured? These two constructs are typically measured via self-report, since they deal directly with the participant's subjective experience. And then how are these two related? So studies consistently show a strong correlation between gratitude and subjective well-being. So we measured a correlation of 0.58 in this study, for example. In addition, there is also evidence of a causal relationship between gratitude and subjective well-being, meaning that gratitude appears to increase subjective well-being. Interestingly, there's evidence that this relationship works in reverse as well, meaning that happiness tends to increase gratitude. So this formed a virtuous cycle between the two. And there are some interesting experimental studies that induce gratitude in participants through various gratitude exercises and measure subsequent changes in subjective well-being as compared with control groups. So we talked a bit about our first two topics, subjective well-being and gratitude, and here I'll talk a little bit about the third one, self-control. So Duckworth and Steinberg in a 2011 meta-analysis note that high self-control is associated with volitional control of behavior, as well as metacognitive processes such as planning and selective attention. Low self-control, on the other hand, is associated with impulsiveness, sensation seeking, and high temporal discount. So this means that if I'm prone to high temporal discounting, I undervalue future rewards and would be more likely to choose a smaller reward now over a comparatively large one that I would receive in the future. So how is it measured? Self-control is operationalized in a number of different ways, such as via informant report, self-report, executive function tasks, and delay of gratification tasks. So there's several ways that it's measured. A meta-analysis by Duckworth and Kern assessed the convergent validity of these measures, that is, the extent to which they measure the same underlying construct. And they found that self-control measures show moderate convergent validity and conclude that there is some evidence that they more or less measure the same general construct. So knowing this, we chose a self-report measure for self-control as well, since we knew that it converged well with the other measures. And then self-control is also associated with increased subjective well-being, as shown in a paper by Nielsen et al., 2019. So we looked previously at the relationship between gratitude and subjective well-being, but what about the relationship between gratitude and self-control? So in general, emotionality is associated with decreased self-control. And this is true for both sides of the emotional valence spectrum. So for example, on the negative side, if I'm angry, I'm more likely to behave impulsively. And also conversely, on the positive side, if I'm excited and overexuberant, I'm also more likely to behave impulsively. And so gratitude is interesting because it kind of breaks this mold. So gratitude is actually associated with increased self-control. And this was reported in a paper by Dickens and DeSteno in 2016. So in summary, both gratitude and self-control are associated with higher happiness or subjective well-being. And then as well, gratitude is associated with higher self-control. And so knowing this, this forms the basis of our research question. And that is, does self-control mediate the gratitude subjective well-being relationship? And I'll talk more about what that means in a bit. So for some basic study info, we recruited 141 EWU students who completed the study via an online survey. So this is an overview of my data analysis process. So first, I cleaned the data and removed participants who had either several missing questions or who didn't pass the data check items that we included. This brought us down to 113. Next, I checked that our statistical assumptions are met with our data, and then I did my analysis. And I'd like to go over two examples of my analyses today. So the first being hierarchical linear regression, which allows us to investigate the general effects of gratitude and self-control on happiness. And the second being our mediation analysis, which is where we investigate the indirect effects, and that pertains to our main research question. So here are the four, so starting with hierarchical linear regression, here are the four assumptions that we need to verify are met. And I'll go through each of these in the next couple slides. So first, we want to confirm that our data forms a bivariate normal distribution. So bivariate just refers to the two variables here on the X and Y axes on the first two figures. So from left to right, figure 1 is a scatter plot of subjective well-being and gratitude. Figure 2 is for subjective well-being and self-control. And we want to see this oval shape here shown in the graphs, and that indicates a bivariate normal distribution. Then on the right, the third figure, I thought this was a cool figure that showed why we want to see the oval shape. So we see on the red line on the left, a normal distribution, and then the blue line, also another normal distribution, and that forms the elliptic shape in the middle. So I thought that was interesting. Okay, so next, before we do our hierarchical regression, we need to make sure that our predictor variables, in this case, gratitude and self-control, are significant predictors of subjective well-being on their own. So as an example, this is subjective well-being regressed on gratitude. So meaning that gratitude would be our predictor variable here. We did this as well for self-control, but I'll just show this example here for gratitude. So we just checked our first assumption for the bivariate normal distribution. So now we need to check the other three. So in the first figure here, this just shows the regression of subjective well-being on gratitude. The second figure in the middle, this shows a normal distribution overlaid with the distribution of our residuals. So the residuals are just the error between the fitted values and the measured values from our graph on the left. And so we see that they're pretty close at forming a normal distribution there. So that assumption's met. Then for number 3, this is for assumption number 3 and the third figure on the right. We want our average residual error to be 0. So that is shown in the horizontal line in the middle of the figure here. So it's pretty close to 0. So that's assumption 3. So that looks good. And then last, assumption 4, we want the variance of our residuals to be even across the fitted values. So the fitted values are shown on the x-axis, and we see that there's a pretty even spread, or variance rather, between fitted values of 3 and 6 for our residuals, but it's quite sparse between 2 and 3. I think that's because in general, our measures for gratitude and subjective well-being skew on the higher end, meaning that we just don't have very many participants that score that low on those scales. Okay, so here are the results for our individual linear regressions for subjective well-being regressed on self-control and for subjective well-being regressed on dispositional gratitude. So we can see that they're both significant predictors of subjective well-being. Both have p-values below 0.001, r-squared for self-control as a predictor is 0.131, r-squared for gratitude as a predictor is 0.335, which is quite high. So we are good to go and include these both as predictors in our model. Okay, so now we're ready to do the hierarchical regression. So in hierarchical regression, we add predictors in one by one in each step to see if they add anything to our model. So in our case, we start with gratitude as a predictor and add self-control. This causes an r-squared increase from 0.335 to 0.384. So we know that it's a valid addition to our model. So from here, we just need to check for collinearity. So if you have really high collinearity between your predictor variables, this indicates that your predictors vary too closely together and might be measuring the same thing. And in that case, you would want to just use 1. So the VIF value is an estimate for collinearity. So ours was 1.07 between self-control and gratitude. So values above 10 would indicate high collinearity. So we look good here too. Okay, so Figure 1 on the bottom left of figure 1 shows the individual regressions for each of the three, and then on the upper right just shows the correlations. So this one, middle top here shows that's the 0.58 correlation I mentioned earlier between subjective well-being and gratitude. Then figure 2 and 3 are the same as for the individual regression. So this is just how we check our assumptions. So our residuals look normally distributed for the most part. They're pretty close to 0 on average. And then we kind of see the same thing where we have a good spread between 3 and 6, but it's pretty sparse on the upper and lower ends of the fitted values. Okay, so next we'll go over our mediation model. And this is how we addressed our main research question. So down on the bottom right, I have the path diagram here. So the C path, this is the overall effect of gratitude on subjective well-being. And then the path going through A and B is the one we're trying to estimate in this study. This is the path we're interested in. So we want to find out how much of the C path is accounted for by the indirect A-B path. So in other words, how much of the relationship between gratitude and subjective well-being is caused by this indirect effect of gratitude on self-control? That is, how much does self-control mediate the relationship between gratitude and subjective well-being? So then the figure on the left shows the output of our model. So we're mainly interested in the A-B path estimates down at the bottom. So we see that the effect size estimate is 0.093 with a p-value of 0.036. So this is below the 0.05 significance threshold, but not by a whole lot. Then up the top, this shows the effect size estimates for the A, B, and C paths individually. So we get the A-B path estimate just by multiplying the A path estimate with the B path estimate. So in conclusion, there is some evidence for a relatively weak mediating effect of self-control, but we would have liked to see a smaller p-value before drawing any strong conclusions here. Yeah, so here are my references, and thanks for listening to my talk.